paralysis that has gripped this country now for more than 3 years. And the only way to do that is to break that deadlock in Parliament. We must end the dither and delay, and we must get Brexit done. That's the most important thing the economy needs right now. And now we can, because the PM has got a good deal. That was a huge achievement, because you'll remember so many people said that we wouldn't be able to. This deal is good for democracy, and it's good for the economy. A strong economy ultimately depends on a strong democracy. Getting this deal through will give business the confidence that it needs, the certainty that it needs to plan and invest for the future. Of course, I talk to businesses all the time. I listen to their concerns. By far, the biggest fear of business is a Corbyn-led government. One of the prizes of this election is the chance to end that threat, defeat Corbynism on December the 12th, and they'll be gone for good. And now that we have a deal, we can finally provide that certainty on Brexit too. Businesses, like the rest of us, they have deadline fatigue. We can finally see the light at the end of the tunnel. But all the Lib Dems, Labour and SNP, all they want to do is to continue to extend that tunnel. We've all had enough of that. Now, the Governor of the Bank of England has said that the deal is positive for the economy. And the certainty of that positive deal will unleash the private sector to invest even more in our country. And we'll all benefit from that deal dividend. Then we can focus on the people's priorities and priming our economies that lie ahead outside the EU, including all the opportunities that will come from that best-in-class free trade agreement with our European friends. Now, all of this is put at risk by Labour, the Lib Dems, and the SNP. So I wanted to take this opportunity today to set at the outset of this campaign to address some of those key issues that I know that people up and down the country will understandably be asking. What is the state of our economy? What's the difference between the Tories and our opponents on how we think our economy should be managed and run? And most importantly, what does it mean for me and my family? Now, later today, the Bank of England will give its latest economic forecast. Forecasts vary. There are a number of global headwinds and challenges. But I am clear that the fundamentals of the UK economy are strong. Our economy has confounded expectations. 9 years of consecutive growth, rising wages, record employment. We've seen, in fact, 1,000 new jobs on average created every single day. Absolute poverty at its lowest on record. Income inequality is lower than when Labour left office in 2010. We've promoted productivity, we've created job opportunities, and we've driven growth in our economy. In fact, the IMF forecasts that next year, the UK will grow faster than France, than Italy, than Germany, than Japan. Now, none of it has happened by accident. Just look at where we were back when I was first elected to Parliament in 2010. The new Conservative government had just inherited the highest levels of borrowing in Britain's peacetime history. A deficit that was equal to 10% of GDP. That was equivalent to borrowing £5,000 every single second. An economy that's been scarred by Labour's Great Recession. It was the deepest recession in almost 100 years. And we saw the worst banking crash, not just in British history, but in global history, right here in our country. The transformation from where we were then to where we are now was not the result of some fiscal cycle or economic inevitability. It was down to solid economic stewardship by successive conservative governments, the hard work and the sacrifice of the British people, and an incredible effort by British businesses of all shapes and sizes. Together, we've laid a foundation on which, with the right decisions, with the right policies, we can build a decade of growth, of opportunity, of prosperity for all. Not just more jobs and higher wages, but more investment in our schools, in our NHS, in our environment, in rail, road, and the digital infrastructure that we all rely on. That's the kind of future that I want to see for my kids and for your kids, for the whole country. But just as the UK's economic miracle did not happen by accident, the future is not guaranteed. And that's why this election is so important. Because we can bring about the future with the right government. Not a government of endless debt and failed ideology, but a sustainable, responsible government, a conservative government. And if you want to see what the next decade could look like, just look at the trail that we've blazed over the last 100 days. We're taking the country forward from a decade of recovery to a decade of renewal. In my spending round in September, we were able to give £13.4 billion boost to the people's priorities. It meant more money for 20,000 new police officers, 20 new hospital upgrades, levelling up of school funding across the country. It also included £2.2 billion for our armed forces and an extra £1.5 billion for social care. I'm extremely proud of what we've been able to achieve in such a short time and the lasting impact that these decisions will have. You see, public services were a lifeline for people like me when I was growing up, and we must nurture them so future generations have the same. And that doesn't mean we believe in an ever-expanding state. For Conservatives, that is neither moral nor sustainable. We believe in social responsibility and sensible stewardship. In this year's spring statement, there was some £27 billion of headroom that was identified at that time. I chose to use half of that. A sound framework continues to be essential. And as Conservatives, we will always have one. And I said in my spending round that historic low borrowing rates mean that we should adjust our framework to fund that decade of renewal. You know, incredibly, at the moment, we can borrow in real terms at negative interest rates, meaning it is a responsible time to invest. And there's a growing consensus around the world that the time to do that is now, as I saw for myself recently when I was at the IMF meetings. So today, I'm announcing new fiscal rules that, if elected, will allow us to take advantage of the opportunity to invest in our future and our public services, but without squandering the hard work of the British people. Now, like anyone who budgets, whether it's in a household, a small business, a large business, I know that we must keep track of what we're spending and what we bring in. We can't run an overdraft forever on a day-to-day spending. So I can confirm that our first rule will be to have a balanced current budget. What we spend cannot exceed what we bring in. Now, while we must maintain spending restraint, if we want growth to continue and get stronger in the future, then we need to invest in it. taking the opportunity offered by those historically low borrowing rates. In our manifesto and at our first budget in the new year, we will announce new plans to level up the entire United Kingdom, from Manchester to Midlothian, spreading opportunity and renewing the fabric of our nation. There'll be new hospitals, schools, railways, better broadband, new connections and opportunities for every part of our great nation. So I can confirm, we will borrow some more to invest. But we know all too well what happens if debt gets out of control. Excessive debt would risk everything the British people have worked so hard to achieve over the past decade of recovery. The question at this election is, who do you trust to protect that? It's why our second rule will ensure that we can invest more, but we will continue to live within our means. Investment in long-term projects like roads and rail will not exceed 3% of GDP. Now, compared to the long-term average of 1.8%, that represents a huge step change in what we currently invest. It means billions of pounds more to spend on the infrastructure revolution that this country needs. Projects like at this airport, the Terminal 2 airport, which I think is the largest construction project going on in the north right now. And it also allows us to think and rekindle our ambition for the first supersonic airline the world has ever seen. Let's rekindle our ambitions and be ambitious about the future. But we also need to strike the right balance and keep that debt in check as we seek to invest more. Now, I believe the combination of these rules means that debt will never be allowed to get out of control. Unlike Labour, we won't kick the can down the road, leaving another toxic legacy of debt for our children and our grandchildren to deal with. As we set out the detail of our plans, it will be clear that debt will be lower in the medium term, meaning that it will be lower at the end of the next Parliament than it will be at the start. Now, we can borrow cheap because rates are currently low, and I expect them to stay low for some time. But the cost of servicing that debt should never be allowed to spiral out of control either, putting the burden back onto taxpayers. So I'm going to have a third rule. And our third rule means that if borrowing costs rise significantly in the future, and what we're paying to service debt starts to exceed historical averages, we would reassess how much we would be willing to borrow for capital projects. This extra safeguard ensures that we will spend the money and manage the costs responsibly. So there you have rules to control borrowing, to control debt, and to control debt interest. New rules for a new economic era. Now, I've set out more details. I will set out more details of these rules in the next budget. But my mission at number 11 is ultimately about more than numbers and rules. Economic growth means nothing if it doesn't mean more jobs, more money in people's pockets, stable prices in our shops. It's about ensuring that the state doesn't take a penny more than it needs to run good services. It means making sure that the cost of living is affordable for all families. And we have that record. We've doubled free childcare to 30 hours a week for working families of 3 and 4-year-olds. We've increased the amount that someone can earn before universal credit is reduced, making 2.4 million working households better off. And we've taken some 4 million people out of income tax altogether by raising the personal allowance. Most importantly, managing the economy is about people having good jobs and a fair and decent wage to live off. That's why I was proud as Business Secretary to help introduce the National Living Wage, and why as Chancellor I've announced plans to increase it to 2/3 of median earnings taking it up to £10.50 and extending it to workers aged over 21. That's how we will end low pay for good in our country by 2024. We'll be one of the first nations in the world to do this, a legacy that we can all be very proud of. Now, anyone who understands economics knows that public and private, they go hand in hand. They're mutually reinforcing. I got ahead because of my family, hard work, and public services. But conservatives understand that it's a dynamic, free market economy that is the single best way to fund those public services. And if people are going to carry on starting a business or creating jobs, carry on paying the taxes that fund our schools and fund the NHS, then they need to know that the government is on their side. Because starting, running, and growing a business is actually one of the hardest things that you can do. I remember when I was a boy and it was a family of 7 sharing a 2-bedroom flat above the family business. We were just getting by. My parents were running the shop downstairs, and every night I'd help my dad count the day's takings at the dinner table. And even as a kid, I could see whether the piles of notes and coins were high enough so that if they were too small, I knew that there may be some problems ahead. We may not be able to have that lunch that we had planned on a Sunday and had to save a bit more during the week. And while the numbers today aren't counted, you don't count this, it might be on a spreadsheet or in your mobile phone rather than a kitchen table. That's still the everyday life of so many small businesses. So I'm proud that this government is making it that little bit easier for you. Proud that we're committed to doing more to help firms prosper. We'll keep costs down for businesses. Since 2016, we've confirmed plans to slash £13 billion on business rates. Since 2010, we've introduced more than 100 measures to tackle aggressive tax avoidance and evasion. And we are continuing to make our tax system simpler and, most importantly, fairer. This shows that we are both the party of business and the party of workers. Because unlike Labour, we never take taxpayers' money for granted. Labour believe that your money belongs to the government unless they choose to graciously give it back to you. Conservatives believe that your money is your money. Labour believe that taxes should be as high as possible and that people should be punished for doing well. Conservatives believe that you ultimately raise more by taxing less, and that if you work hard and you get that promotion and you get that pay rise, you shouldn't be worse off. That's why this election is so important. It's not just a choice of who governs Britain, but whether you want the government to make this country stronger, richer, more united, or more indebted and even more divided than ever before. John McDonnell likes to claim that he won't raise taxes on anyone earning less than £80,000. But it's just not true. It just isn't. He cannot be trusted. It's easy to poke fun at Comrade Corbyn and his fantasy economics. But this will be a close election. We cannot take anything for granted. We won't let Labour off the hook like last time. Look to the lessons of history. They'll ruin your finances, they'll raise your taxes, they'll saddle the next generation with debt. Every single Labour government in history has left this country with an economic crisis. Now, some of you may be old enough to remember the Winter of Discontent in 1979, where rubbish piled up on the streets and bodies went unburied. Or those of you that are younger might remember the aftermath of the financial crisis in 2008, where an arrogant and out-of-touch Labour government took its eye off the ball and allowed the economy and our public finances to come to the edge of ruin. We spent a decade recovering from that one. And it's taken years of a responsible Tory management, of hard work of the British people, for the wages and the living standards to rise back to pre-crisis levels. Last time, after promising to stick to Tory spending plans initially, it took Labour 13 years to completely mess it up. This time, it won't even take them 13 months. Just listen to the things that McDonnell is openly proposing. And I gather you won't have to wait long. He's about to speak not too far from here in Liverpool. He's going to be spending billions on renationalizing vast industries, but without paying market rates to their owners. These owners, they're not tycoons. They're mostly small investors, often holding this investment through their pension pots. He told savers and businesses that he had nothing up his sleeves. But then he went on to announce plans to confiscate £300 billion of shares from private investors. That would be one of the biggest ever state raids on the savings of hard-working people. That's not socking it to the rich. That's stealing private investments. And who owns those investments? Your pension funds. He claims he will hike taxes on the richest in society only. But then he can't explain who will pay for the services, when some of those people who now pay more than a quarter of all income tax, when some of them choose to go elsewhere. Under the Conservatives, the top 1% pay more in tax than ever before. Labour's punitive tax rates, they haven't worked in the past and they won't work now. And who will have to pay the price? Not them, but ordinary working people, people like you. Because Labour can't even begin to attempt to meet their commitments without raising your taxes, hiking your bills, and letting prices run wild in the shops. And not only that, but they cannot get into government without selling out our union. You know, Corbyn has never cared about the United Kingdom. The only deal he will prioritise is actually the deal that he wants with the SNP. What's not for him to like about that party, the party that is responsible for the highest level of taxation in the UK, its neglected public services in pursuit of an ideological agenda. Now, we can't let 2020 be the year of the rerun of 2 referendums. That's the last thing our economy and our democracy need. We are 35 days from the day that we will decide how this country looks for the next decade and beyond. 35 days in which to decide whether we want to build on the strong foundations laid by the Conservatives and the British people, or we want to let Corbyn and McDonnell tear down the whole thing. That is the choice for the nation, whether December brings a Merry Christmas or another winter of discontent. A Labour Party determined to wind back the clock, waste billions and raise taxes, or a Conservative government with the track record to deliver on a decade of renewal, helping working people, cracking down on the cost of living and getting Brexit done. Voting Conservative is the only way to end the double whammy of uncertainty that's been posed by a prolonged Brexit and the prospect of the hardest left government of any major Western nation. With our responsible but ambitious agenda, we will level up across the country so that we can unleash the potential as the nation for the years ahead, and so that everyone has the chance to unleash their potential. With this new economic plan for a new economic era, I truly believe that the 2020s will be Britain's best decade yet. Thank you all very much. you. Thank you all again for coming. I'm going to take some questions. I'm going to start with members of the media that are here. And I've got a list here, so I'll just stick to the list. And I'll start with Shabab Khan from ITV News.
Mr. Javid, you said that one of your fiscal rules will be to balance current budgets. You've said you'll borrow money to invest. Does that mean you can't afford to make the tax cuts that Boris Johnson promised during his Tory leadership campaign?
It means that if we stick to these rules that I've set out today, we can afford to do a lot. We can afford to make sure that we live within our means on day-to-day spending. We can afford the infrastructure revolution that I've talked of, which is really leveling up across the country, investing billions more, but keeping an eye on debt. But it also does mean that we can afford some tax cuts. We've worked out the numbers, and we can, within these rules, have tax cuts, investment in infrastructure, and balance the day-to-day funding of the economy. I've got Alex from Sky News, please.
Hello there. You talk about the future you want to see for the country's children. But the Institute for Fiscal Studies has warned that with borrowing rising, your government risks saddling future generations with more debt. Are you not guilty of what you are accusing Labour of doing? Borrowing more, spending big, wasting the country's finances?
Not at all. I mean, the difference between our approach and Labour's approach is like night and day. There's a huge gulf in difference in our economic approach. What I've set out today is sensible stewardship of the economy, realizing that there can be good reasons to borrow, especially at these historically low interest rates, as long as you're going to turn that borrowing into productive investment. The roads, the rail, the fibre optic, the flood defences, the things that are actually going to improve our productivity over time. And levelling up and doing that across the country. So you're doing it in the north as well as the south, in Scotland, Northern Ireland, Wales, throughout the UK. But we need to be tough on that in the sense that we need to keep that under control. And the rules I've set out will do just that. And as I said, it will mean that debt throughout the Parliament will be lower at the end than it is at the start. So we will actually bring debt as a proportion of GDP down and keep it under control. What we've heard from Labour, and I think we're going to hear some more shortly, but there's been some sort of pre-briefing from McDonnell and his team last night. I think they've already said that there's another £150 billion fund that they've just conjured up, on top of the £250 billion fund, another £300 billion fund, the cost of £200 billion nationalisation, all of that. I'm not even sure they're going to have any fiscal rules. Even if they did, there is no way they can meet those rules. And if they even tried, they would have to do it with a massive tax bombshell on ordinary, hardworking people. And this is something that every Labour government has done. But this one, in particular, will be even worse than any Labour government that has preceded it. And, if you don't want to take my word for it today, listen to Ian Austin, who worked for Gordon Brown, worked in the Treasury with Gordon Brown, is Labour through and through. And he has said today, that Corbyn, McDonnell will absolutely ruin this economy and they will cost jobs and businesses throughout the country, and he's even gone as far as saying, vote for anyone in any seat that can stop Corbyn, vote Conservative. I've got is it Nina from the BBC?
Hello. You criticise Labour's credibility, but what swing voters in places like Blackpool, Bury, Crewe, places you need to win, will hear this morning is £150 billion of investment in public services, moving a Treasury ministerial office to the north of England. They've suffered for nearly 10 years under austerity. Why on earth wouldn't those swing voters go with Labour?
Because, first of all, I think that, as I've said today as well, and said many times, you can't really say enough, that we need to level up across the country. That means whether you're living in the north or the south, that every part of the country matters. The answer to your question, though, I think, is that all those things that we all want to see, whether you live in the north or any part of the UK, all those strong public services, that investment that you want to see in your infrastructure, your local infrastructure, that can only happen if you've got a strong economy. You cannot do that if you crater the economy and you destroy it. And if you look at any independent analysis that has been done of Labour's plans, and let's see, over the next few days, they'll set out more and they'll continue to set out hundreds of billions of more promised borrowing, but it is utterly meaningless. You mentioned 150 billion. He might as well, McDonald, say 1 trillion, 2 trillion, 3 trillion, because they're meaningless numbers. Because even if he tried to do what he said, if he tried to keep his word, he will crash the economy. And those people that you're talking about, those hardworking people, will pay the price with their jobs, their livelihoods, and ever increasing taxes. And no one wants to see that. I've got John from the Daily Mail.
Chancellor, do you still think that stamp duty is a priority for reform?
Well, you're tempting me about some of the decisions we'll make in due course. I'm not going to get into any particular taxes today. I've talked about earlier about an ambition to always try to see how we can get taxes in general down, but you forgive me, I'm not going to get into a particular tax today. Anna, please, from the Daily Telegraph.
Could you please specify how much you're planning to borrow for infrastructure? You're saying you're going to borrow to invest. You've said in the past that you want a £100 billion infrastructure fund. Can you give us some detail on what you would actually borrow?
Yeah, the rules that I've set out today, which will allow us to borrow more responsibly, but we naturally, because of the rules, we want to have a sort of safeguard, as it were, to make sure that debt doesn't spiral out of control. They would allow us. So historically, we've invested as a country about 1.8% of GDP a year in infrastructure. If you say add a percentage point on that, which you comfortably can do on rules, that's about potentially an extra £20 billion a year over a 5-year period, or between 5, you can easily add another 100 billion to that. And so we will set out both in our manifesto and then if we win in a future budget, much more detail about what this infrastructure investment looks like. But again, I just bring it back to the point. The reason we can afford to do that is because we've had this decade of recovery. We want this decade of renewal, but we risk losing it all if we let debt get out of control again. And that's why you need to have rules. You need to have these safeguards, because ultimately they protect the very people you're trying to help with that infrastructure, which is ordinary, hardworking people, which want to see a continued growing economy. And with Labour's plans, they will risk all of that disappearing and economic ruin. And I've got Jennifer, I'll come back to you in a sec. Jennifer from Manchester Evening News.
Hello.
Sorry,
Hey,
hi.
Hi. You talked then about borrowing an extra £20 billion a year. Northern Powerhouse Rail, I think, has been costed at £39 billion by Northern leaders. And Boris Johnson has said that he supports the whole of that project, although he's only actually committed to the Manchester to Leeds part of it. So my question is, if that's how much you're going to be adding in borrowing, can you afford to commit to the whole of Northern Powerhouse Rail in full? And will you be doing so in the Conservative manifesto?
Well, again, I'm not going to announce the details of the manifesto today, but let me just say this about the Northern Powerhouse Rail. I've had I know quite a bit about it. I think it's an ambitious plan. It's just the kind of plan I think certainly I want to see for the North. As you say, we've already set out plans to invest in sort of part of that, and I'm very keen to see it go further. And we are working with the team behind it on refining a business plan. So whilst I don't want to make an announcement on that today, our plans, the ones I've just set out, that figure you've used for Northern Powerhouse Rail is over multiple years. And so our plans would comfortably allow us, if we want to all go ahead together, to plan both in more rail in the north, as well as other parts of our country. But again, what I just can't stress enough, that whilst we have this extra sort of firepower to invest in infrastructure, it's only there because the economy is strong, and if we want to keep it that way, we've got to keep debt under control. We have plans to do that. The Labour Party can promise, spray money around like confetti, but it doesn't mean anything if they can't actually deliver, because they would have already crashed the economy before the spades hit the ground. I will, just there, please.
Thank you very much. Andy Bell, 5 News. Your predecessor was so concerned about the no-deal Brexit, he built in some headroom. You've already spent half of that. Isn't it irresponsible when there's still such a huge unknown hanging over the economy when it comes to Brexit? Isn't it irresponsible to be talking about borrowing and spending so much more?
No, I mean, not at all. I mean, first of all, I actually made a short reference to it in my remarks earlier, that my predecessor had said that there was, he had identified around 27 billion of headroom. I chose to use half of that. I think that's very responsible. And also, the plans that I've set out, including the plans that I've set out today, are eminently affordable based on the work that I've done, the work that the Treasury had done in preparing for a future budget. So I think it's all perfectly affordable. But again, it's affordable because the economy is strong. The economy will be growing. Later today, we will have a sort of a new forecast that no one has seen, but it will come later today, which is from a very, very, very reputable organization with the Bank of England. So let's see what they say about future growth as well, and ability to afford these investments. But again, it just all really does come back to the difference between Labour and the Conservatives just couldn't be bigger in this, is that, we have a responsible plan that will allow us to have that decade of renewal, but we've got to have a safeguard so debt doesn't get out of control and ordinary people don't pay the price. Labour have no such plans. Anything they say, anything John McDonnell promises today, it doesn't matter if it's an extra pound, an extra 150 billion, or an extra trillion, it just cannot be relied on. Before he spends any of that money, the economy will be ruined. I'm going to leave it there. Thank you all very much. Thank you so much for coming along today. Thank you.